For more than 300 years, the hardest ingredient in gunpowder to obtain was collected from horse stables, compost piles, and even human urine. Literally speaking, some of the most powerful armies in history once fought using urine. Without it, there would be no gunpowder. Without gunpowder, there would be no cannons or rifles, and world history would likely have turned out very differently. That strange material was just one of the 3 ingredients used to make gunpowder. And the story behind all 3 is far stranger than most people realize. Today, let's explore exactly how gunpowder was made, and why just 3 simple ingredients were able to create the substance that changed warfare forever. It all started with an accident. In 850 AD, Taoist alchemists during China's Tang Dynasty were searching for the secret to eternal life. They mixed saltpeter, sulfur, and charcoal, heated the mixture, and waited for a miracle. What they got was not immortality. Records from the time describe how the mixture burned the hands and faces of the people who made it. The first recorded mention of gunpowder was not a recipe. It was a warning. The Chinese called it huoyao, or fire medicine. It was born in a medical laboratory, not a weapons workshop. But anything dangerous eventually becomes a weapon. By 1132, gunpowder was being packed into bamboo tubes to launch projectiles, becoming the earliest known ancestor of the gun. The Song dynasty tightly controlled it as a state secret. But secrets rarely stay secret forever. Through the Mongol conquests and along the Silk Road, gunpowder found its way to Europe, arriving nearly 5 centuries after it first appeared in China. And the world began to change in a way that no one could ever reverse. Gunpowder only has 3 ingredients. Looking at them, no one would guess this was the formula that changed the world. The first is charcoal. So easy to make it almost seems meaningless. Burn wood, let it cool, and that is it. But not all wood was the same. After centuries of experimentation, people discovered that willow wood produced the best charcoal. Some workshops even used only a single type of wood, because changing the raw material could completely alter the burn rate of an entire batch of powder. The second ingredient is sulfur, making up 10% of the mixture. Not rare, but not found everywhere either. Its role was simple. Lower the ignition temperature enough for the entire reaction to happen quickly and evenly. The third ingredient was saltpeter, making up 75% of the mixture. It was the hardest to obtain and by far the strangest. Saltpeter is an oxidizer, meaning it carries its own oxygen and does not rely on the surrounding air. In theory, once ignited, the reaction could continue even in an environment with almost no oxygen. And for more than 300 years, that ingredient was collected from places nobody liked to talk about: bat caves, horse stables, rotting compost piles, and human urine. Saltpeter forms naturally through the bacterial breakdown of organic waste, and there were few places better for it to develop than those. The famous 75-15-10 ratio was not invented overnight. It was the result of centuries of experimentation, countless accidental explosions, and many people who became lessons for those who came after them. Knowing the 3 ingredients was only the beginning. The real challenge was not finding them. It was mixing them together and making it out of the workshop alive. The first step was refining saltpeter from raw materials. Animal manure, soil from horse stables, and decomposing organic waste were dissolved in hot water, filtered repeatedly, and left to crystallize. And this was still the safest part of the entire process. Next came grinding. Each ingredient had to be ground separately, inside separate rooms. The reason was brutally simple. Grinding them together created friction, and friction alone was enough to ignite an entire batch right on the table. The finer the powder became, the greater the surface area, and the faster and more violent the reaction would be. Once the fine powders were ready, it was time to mix them, but never dry. Water or alcohol was added to reduce friction, eliminate static electricity, and keep the ingredients from separating during transport. This was the stage where a single spark could erase an entire workshop before anyone had time to react. The wet mixture was then pressed to cakes, broken into grains, and filtered through sieves in a step known as corning. Large grains burned slowly for cannons, while smaller grains burned quickly for handheld firearms. The same formula, but different grain sizes created completely different weapons. Workers were forbidden from wearing metal-nailed shoes. Wool clothing was banned. Every tool inside the workshop was made from wood or brass. All of it was done to prevent a single spark. Even then, accidents still happened. Gunpowder mills across Europe and China exploded again and again, wiping out entire groups of workers because of one small mistake. This was not a factory assembly line. It was a daily battle against something always waiting to turn on the people creating it. Three ingredients, one reaction, and everything happens in a fraction of a second. What made gunpowder different from ordinary fire was saltpeter. Normal fire needs oxygen from the surrounding air to keep burning. Gunpowder does not. Saltpeter carries its own oxygen, and once the reaction begins, there is very little that can stop it. In theory, once ignited, gunpowder can continue burning even in environments with almost no oxygen. The result is an enormous amount of gas produced almost instantly, expanding with enough pressure to drive a bullet through a gun barrel or tear apart a castle wall. But gunpowder was actually far less efficient than most people imagine. Only around 25 to 30% of its energy was used to propel the projectile. The rest escaped as heat, sound, and the thick white smoke that covered battlefields before the 20th century. That was also the reason gunpowder was eventually replaced. Smokeless powder, the modern propellant, was far more efficient, burned cleaner, and did not leave behind clouds of smoke that blocked a shooter's vision. But the principle remained the same, creating expanding gas fast enough to turn chemistry into force. Most of gunpowder's history is tied to war. But the world's most dangerous weapon also helped build civilization in a completely different way. Before dynamite was invented in 1867, gunpowder was the only tool humans had for breaking apart things too hard and too massive to destroy by hand. For more than 300 years, every tunnel, every coal mine, and every stone quarry depended on it. Miners packed gunpowder into cracks in solid rock, lit the fuse, and ran. There was no exact formula for a safe distance. You learned through experience, or you did not survive long enough to learn at all. Fireworks were a different story. Born in China almost at the same time as gunpowder itself, fireworks were originally used in religious ceremonies to drive away evil spirits. Today, even though modern weapons abandoned black powder long ago, fireworks still rely on it for one simple reason. Nothing controls burn speed and color effects quite as well. But even all of that was still not the greatest impact gunpowder would have on the world. Before gunpowder, power in Europe was measured by the thickness of castle walls. A castle was not just a home. It was a statement of power. Build walls high enough and thick enough, and no army could touch you. The feudal system survived for centuries, partly because of that logic. Gunpowder destroyed that logic within just a few decades. Cannons did not simply break walls. They shattered the entire foundation of medieval society. Building and maintaining heavy artillery was so expensive that only kings could truly afford it. From that point on, war was no longer the game of local lords. It became something only monarchs with vast resources could participate in. At the same time, Gunpowder also democratized the battlefield in another way. Training a knight took decades, beginning in childhood and continuing through years of practice with spears, swords, and horseback combat. A gunpowder soldier could be trained in just a few months. The advantage of heavy armor and lifetime combat skill disappeared with a single bullet. The climax of all these changes came in 1453. The Ottomans arrived outside Constantinople with the largest cannons ever built and began bombarding walls that had stood for nearly 1,000 years. The walls collapsed. Constantinople fell. The last remnant of the Roman Empire finally came to an end. Not because of a lack of courage, not because of poor strategy, but because of a black powder mixed in the right proportions. Gunpowder began as an accident. A group of people were searching for immortality, but what they discovered instead became something that would take more lives than almost any invention before it. 3 ingredients, 1 formula, and a chain of consequences that none of those alchemists in 850 could have imagined. Empires collapsing, 1,000-year-old walls crumbling, and a social order that had survived for centuries disappearing within just a few decades. Today, black powder has almost completely vanished from the battlefield. But every time fireworks explode across the night sky, it is still the same chemical reaction, the same 3 ingredients, and the same black powder first discovered by people who only wanted to live forever. They never found the secret to immortality, but in a way, they created something that would outlive them all.